Have you ever thought to yourself what a truly free place would look like? Think about all the things that you're obliged to do just to exist. Pay taxes, respect state laws, get an education, get a job, pay taxes, save for a mortgage, save for a pension, adhere to zoning regulations, pay taxes, and respect the decisions of a government that maybe you never chose in the first place, and pay taxes. The question of how to free oneself from the unwanted restrictions of society is something we've all pondered. But one town in the US seemingly found the answer to the taxes part, at least. They seemed to find the key to living in freedom and prosperity, a sort of idyllic return to the state of nature. This was the Freetown Project, and it ran into every kind of problem possible, from garbage accumulation to neighbor disputes to the presence of sex offenders to murder and to taxes, before the whole thing crumbled at the hands of its most unexpected obstacle. And it's not taxes, it's actually bears. All this unfolded in Grafton, New Hampshire, a town now synonymous with the most disastrous libertarian misadventure to date, out of many to choose from, by the way. So let's get into it. The Libertarians. If you followed any of our other channels, then you'll be fairly well versed in all that this ideology entails. If not, here is a very quick crash course for you. Libertarianism starts with a relatively simple premise: leave people alone. The principle holds that the natural harmony between productive people is enough to generally satisfy society's ills and inequalities. If you're not hurting anyone else, you should be free to live however you want, and a government should not provide a hindrance to that. Especially unwelcome, especially to libertarians in the US, is taxation, which they believe robs productive people of hard-earned income while benefiting unproductive people in kind. In general, many libertarians believe that the less state, the better. By extension, in some circles, like the one we're describing today, to be labeled a statist is akin to being called something like a racist or a pervert. The word freedom also features prominently in libertarian discourse, often revolving around freedom of expression, freedom of enterprise, freedom from tyranny and state overreach, freedom of religion, and freedom to do what one wants with their body and property. The state, at best, should play an enabling role, going about as far as to protect your basic rights and otherwise stepping back to let you do the rest. That's not to say they are all unanimous on what a state of freedom should look like. Libertarian minarchists want a tiny night watchman state to ensure some semblance of law and order, while anarcho-capitalists think that governments should be scrapped totally in favor of purely voluntary systems. Many libertarians are divided on topics like abortion, which some argue falls within the remit of self-ownership, but others argue entails harm to someone else, in this case the unborn fetus. But by no means is libertarianism a stupid ideology, far from it in fact. Its emphasis on individual liberty and not necessitating harm to others stood libertarians commendably on topics like slavery and LGBT rights. But its principles place a large emphasis on rationalism, which, as in the case of the Freetown Project, could represent something of a stumbling stone. One person's reason, you see, could be another person's lunacy. Grafton's libertarians found that out in real life. You see, there were plenty of things they all absolutely did not agree on. Unfortunately, not much of this was foreseen amidst the excitement of the Freetown Project, which began in the early 2000s. Libertarians in the US had long looked for an opportunity to found a community based on their shared principles of free market capitalism. As they saw it, the state should not have any cause to prevent them from doing so, at least one purportedly as free as the US claimed to be. And there was a man who could perhaps turn their objective into a reality. Step forward, John Babiasz. Babiasz was a former software engineer who felt that the idea of freedom from all intrusions, taxes, and responsibilities was just great, and that Grafton was exactly the place where that could be achieved. He settled in the town with his freedom-loving wife, Rosalie, in the early 1990s, where he spent his time running a small computer company, climbing the ranks of the New Hampshire Libertarian Party, and leading the local volunteer fire department. And keep that in mind, because fire would become a significant feature in the Freetown's life and ugly death. But Babiasz's ambitions were hardly restricted to just overhauling a town in the middle of New Hampshire. By the early 2000s, he had twice run for governor of the state on the Libertarian Party ticket, passionately making the case for the cause but falling short with around 1% of the votes each time. maybe it wouldn't do his aspirations any harm to have some libertarian fellow travelers come and inhabit the Freedom State. This would at once raise the profile of libertarianism and expand his electorate concurrently. So, with the help of a few allies, a call to action went out on various freedom forums. In late 2003, libertarians started abandoning messaging boards for their New Hampshire nirvana. Scores of devotees started to arrive in Grafton to help their collective idea dawn. And with that, the Freetown Project was in motion. However, the project wasn't actually a particularly original idea. In fact, it might surprise you that the idea to kickstart a libertarian commune had infamously seen life several times before. Perhaps the most famous example of this was the Republic of Minerva, which had a short-lived existence on a Pacific reef in the early 1970s. And the fate of Minerva might just have been a clue as to how exactly the Freetown Project would end up. The Republic of Minerva wasn't a great idea, but it was a somewhat pioneering one. The plan leaned heavily on the legal concept of terra nullius, or territory not under the sovereignty of any state, theoretically allowing a third party to claim it through occupation or just squatting. Minerva's ideologues, a libertarian group known as the Phoenix Foundation, decided that if they could find an inhabitable but unoccupied patch of land, pitch their flag in it, and magic up a state out of nothing, it would be the perfect start point for the libertarian cause to spread its wings from. Trouble is, there has never been all that many places in the world that are considered terra nullius. Those that are quite often claimed by some country in one sense or another, but the Foundation thought they found their loophole. They noticed that the Pacific nation of Tonga seemingly forgot to claim sovereignty over an isolated reef called Minerva when it gained independence in 1970. So they marched in with sand, cement, and ambition in tow and officially kind of founded the Republic of Minerva on January the 19th, 1972. Now, I'm not going to go into too much detail about all of that, but suffice to say that the project didn't last very long. The Libertarians had succeeded in building little more than a concrete platform before Tonga sailed in and kicked them out. The Republic hasn't existed ever since, although some Phoenix devotees did try to revive the idea by re-attempting to settle the reef in 1982. This sort of stubbornness would become characteristic of later libertarian projects, of which there would be many. The thing is, although the Republic of Minerva hadn't accomplished anything, the Libertarians could say that it hadn't failed either. It hadn't, after all, been truly allowed to get off the ground in the first place. One could say it was a characteristic example of state overreach. In this case, the wrathful police behind the Free State Project decided to stop wasting time on tyrannical reefs and find somewhere nice and close to home instead. And now John Babiash seemed to offer the answer. Instead of the hostile waters of Minerva, the next episode of Libertarian town building could kick off in little old Grafton instead. And in some ways, the town was the perfect spot. This was New Hampshire, a state whose devotion to the concept of liberty was made clear by its motto, live free or die. The Granite State had been the first of the 13 colonies to declare its own constitution, and Grafton's early inhabitants, going all the way back to the Revolutionary War era, had shown a fondness for freedom that eclipsed even their fellow New Hampshirites. They really hated taxes, to the extent they'd named their town after the 3rd Duke of Grafton, a British nobleman who'd favoured lowering taxes for Americans during the colonial wars. Grafton residents had basically spent the period ever since doing their best to dodge their fiscal responsibilities. It was this that had brought John and Rosalie to live there in the first place and become irked at the irritating tax requirements of their home state of Connecticut. The only thing was that Grafton had a bit of a black bear problem, which early Graftonites had resolved by shooting just about every last one they saw. By the 90s, the bear population was still large and occasionally unpredictable, which one resident found out when a black bear devoured her cats in 1999. Still, the bears weren't known to be all that much of a threat to humans, and the creatures wouldn't really become that much of a problem until, well, immediately after the Freetown Project started. But they weren't a problem right now. The space was set for adherents of the cause to abandon their internet message boards and take their vision to Grafton. And so, in 2004, the Freetown Project was born. Its life and demise became the stuff of infamy, described in vivid detail by Pulitzer Prize-nominated writer Matthew Hongos Hetling. His book, A Libertarian Walks into a Bear, chronicled the trials of this project, which he visited several times during the course of the Freetown's short but adventurous life. John and Rosalie Babash may have been the project's advance party, but that certainly didn't mean they were its only architects. Among the project's vanguard was Larry Pendarvis, a libertarian from Florida who'd had 7 or 8 wives, including 2 at one time, and some rather colorful worldviews. He also had a conviction for possession of indecent images of children, but it was overturned when the prosecutor falsified court documents to describe him as a pervert instead of an introvert. Pendarvis's ideas weren't, in fact, just colorful and were some of the worst ideological positions in human history. He supported the right to traffic organs, resolve disputes by dueling, and to be able to organize so-called bum fights between willing homeless people. Another founding father of Freetown was Robert Peter Hull, nicknamed Silent Bob, a businessman who'd had the financial muscle to purchase land in Grafton, as well as Tim Comden, a lawyer who really liked the idea of defunding the local public school district. Another significant figure was Adam Fran, an anti-capitalist, of all things, whose contribution to the Freetown was a survivalist camp known as Tent City, which promoted outdoors living to people who knew nothing of outdoors living in an area teeming with bears, remember. Pendarvis, Hull, and Condon had scouted a libertarian haven for some time before winding up in Grafton. With the help of John and Rosalie, they decided they'd now found their Elysium. And once Freetowners started arriving, it seemed the project was destined for success. But chaos reigned as early as the first town meeting in June of 2004. The Libertarians brought with them their ideals, not least that, you guessed it, taxation was theft. Resultingly, they voted to cut the level of tax in Grafton to almost minimal levels. While this was great news for budding entrepreneurs amongst them, it was not great news for the town. Grafton's meager annual budget of $1 million was slashed by no less than 30%, leading to the downsizing of the police force to exactly one person, Police Chief Merle Kenyon. Kenyon found himself unable to solve crimes because of a broken-down police vehicle, which there was no money to fix, and things like bin collection, road maintenance, and even streetlights soon went out the window. In terms of community cohesion, things got off to a similarly rough start. Longtime Graftonites may have been rabidly opposed to taxes, but that didn't mean they saw eye to eye with their new neighbors on much else, many of whom also failed to see eye to eye with each other. Larry Pendarvis had taken to promoting relocation to the town by way of his own warped ambitions, which included legislation of organ trafficking, bum fights, and cannibalism. This didn't really wash with some of the locals, and the earliest town hall meeting turned into a farce. But it didn't really matter. Freetowners swarmed council meetings, all while buying properties or just installing themselves in Tent City. Pendarvis was shepherded out of view and tried his luck at starting a new project in Texas instead. The initial bad press was dismissed as simply the ramblings of one bad egg. Between 2004 and 2009, more libertarians flocked to Grafton, and the Freetown project was in full swing. As the libertarian activists arrived in Grafton, the population swelled. From a little over 1,000 people in 2000, the town grew to over 1,300 by 2010. That figure was likely an undercount, since many residents were residing in informal accommodation and had little interest in nanny-state activities like census taking. It was in those same informal settlements that some of Grafton's existing new enterprises were slated to take off, except the residents just weren't very good at anything, so the Freetown experienced difficulty in seeing its economy flourish. The fact that the population had risen suddenly but unorganically created other problems. Each of those new arrivals had to find somewhere to live and something to do, which turned out to be something easier said than done. What resulted was an eclectic but unprofitable variety of special interest personnel, like Richard Angel, a libertarian whose cause of choice was opposing circumcision, for which he went by the nickname Dick Angel. But, surprisingly, anti-circumcision activism just isn't a lucrative industry, and it contributed little to the free market economy. While nearby towns had, for years, grown slowly and incrementally, allowing the development of new schools, new businesses, new opportunities, and new accommodation, Grafton was now saddled with a rise in population without the means to seamlessly integrate it. The town's gender balance was awkwardly lopsided in favor of men, with around 60% of the 1,200 residents now being dudes. The Freetowners also brought guns. Lots of guns. Some carried guns to fend off bears, others carried guns just to be able to bear guns, and many took their guns wherever they went. But this wasn't the only peculiar fact of life in the Freetown project. The inhabitants of the tent city began to grow marijuana and cook meth, safe in the belief that Police Chief Merle Kenyon would face an uphill battle to stop them, being alone and with a broken-down car against a group of heavily armed squatters who hated statist actors, like the police. Unfortunately, all of this eventually dovetailed with a pronounced rise in serious crime. In 2011, the first murder in Grafton's documented history took place when a man in temporary accommodation shot and killed 2 of his roommates. Another murder took place in 2013, and calls to the barely operational police service rose dramatically, even as its funding, by way of citizen votes, dried up. Grafton was also left with next to no amenities. It had one tourism attraction, a pretty cool open-pit mine, but little services other than a struggling general store. Its depleted coffers meant difficulty in keeping lights in municipal buildings on, and soon more of the vanishing funds were being spent on a new purpose: legal fees. The Freetowners were enthusiastic litigators and kept taking the municipality to court in order to set various legal precedents. John Babash was no different. He and Silent Bob took a lawsuit concerning the salaries of elected county officials all the way to the New Hampshire Supreme Court in 2010. Babash may have been somewhat emboldened by his recent electoral success. He hadn't succeeded in reaching public office, but he had become the head of Grafton's privately funded fire department in 2008, securing a landslide victory in a vote of 10 people. Fire safety was something he believed in very strongly and was happy to compromise his anti-authoritarian principles to prevent campfires from burning the whole town to the ground. For this, he was labelled a statist by his peers, and he failed in his third run for governor of New Hampshire with 2% of the vote. Basically doubled his previous attempts though, didn't he? As the Freetown limped on, Grafton became a lawless Wild West filled with opinionated people who devoted themselves entirely to refining or introducing new laws. Amidst all this, another problem was also brewing, one that was slowly becoming harder and harder to ignore. Enter the bears. Now, here are places we are not animal behavior experts, but obviously black bears are neither the largest nor the most aggressive type of bear that you can come across. It's estimated that North America's 750,000 black bears kill less than one person per year on average. That doesn't make them not terrifying, though. A black bear has the strength to topple boulders, coupled with the ability to reach sprint speeds of up to 56 kilometers per hour, significantly faster than Usain Bolt, by the way. You can't outrun them. These two facts alone are enough to make them creatures absolutely not to be messed with. But for good measure, they also possess supreme eyesight and hearing, as well as the ability to smell something like delicious decaying garbage from quite a distance. Nobody is entirely sure why black bears started to show up more frequently in Grafton. Years later, Robert Babash stubbornly claimed that the presence of the Freetown had nothing to do with the phenomenon. And he knew what he was talking about. He had been living in the town since long before the project began, and a bear had eaten his ram in the 1990s. Despite this, it has been theorized that the project had everything to do with the bears, or at the very least, with their increasingly strange behavior. You see, the free-spirited folk of the Free State Project had their own ideas about things that the state would normally do, and usually they just didn't do them. As mentioned, their assaults on town funding had hampered garbage disposal, which led to large piles of accumulated rubbish, creating a draw for nearby wildlife. The garbage would normally have been collected by municipal bin collectors, but with no taxes to pay them, well, the bins didn't get collected, did they? The bears soon began to raid the bins, buoyed by another thing the Freetowners had seemingly decided not to do: by bear-resistant containers. In parts of North America, with bear populations, it is relatively common practice to set up such containers, in addition to fences and other deterrents, to keep the animals from gathering. The New Hampshireites had known this. Many of the Freetowners didn't, and, as it turns out, didn't really care. Some offered dubious counter-arguments to the containers, reasoning that children could somehow force them open and get trapped inside, even if bears with Herculean levels of strength couldn't. So the bears started descending on Grafton in droves, buoyed by the offer of readily available calories. With time, this did become an increasing hazard. But like with everything else, the Freetowners were far from unanimous on how to deal with it. Some took a laissez-faire approach, believing this should be something for the gods of the free market to resolve. They nonetheless began fortifying their properties and going everywhere with handguns as protection against roaming bears. Others believed that no response was enforceable, since each resident's property was their realm and they were free to do with it as they pleased. Some ran with this and did the exact opposite of what should be done. A Graftonite known as Donut Lady began feeding the bears with sweet treats, leading not only to an ever larger population turning up at her door, but an ever greater problem for the townsfolk to contend with. This continued for years, and Donut Lady practically bankrupted herself feeding the ravenous creatures on her doorstep. Yet she wasn't alone. Several other Grafton households did likewise. John Babash conceded this, and while downplaying the extent of the town's bear problems, conceded that the feeding was, quote, not good for humans. Becoming addicted to such feeding, the bears seemed to begin actually skipping hibernation, something as much due to the free food as the toxoplasmosis likely now accumulating in their brains due to consuming garbage laced with domestic animal droppings. They began to get more aggressive and more daring with their choice of meal. Pets started to vanish, and all of this led to a new kind of fear. As pondered by Hongoltz Hetling, who really knew if the animals would become a sort of gateway drug for the bears targeting humans next? The inhabitants of Adam Franz's tent city were particularly vulnerable to the hungry, sleep-deprived, and now lunatic black bears, although they did attempt to resolve the issue by installing a No Bears Allowed sign on the perimeter of the campsite. Right. With time, Tent City shut itself in a walled-up fortress, with the objective of living free seemingly evaporating beneath the scourge of bears. Unsurprisingly, the bear problem didn't get resolved and remained a rather huge issue for the remainder of the time that the Free State Project existed. As they became more addicted to food, more infected with parasites, and as their numbers grew and grew, the incursions grew ever more daring. In the meantime, other parts of the project weren't going well either. Despite the Libertarians' faith in the liberty of the enterprise, Grafton still had no industries and struggled to keep everyday amenities functional. It did have an old church house, which the church had offered to sell for free to the Freetowners. They refused, having no plans to spend even a cent to have the building appraised. So, an individual named John Connell stepped in, spending a large part of his pension to purchase the building. Being a religious man, Connell promptly made himself the church's chaplain and sexton. But as noted by the Citation Needed podcast, the departure of church authorities was sort of a damning indictment all of its own. When tax-free providers of nothing pulled out of Grafton because they felt they were getting a raw deal, it could be sensed that something was definitely amiss. Connell didn't succeed in getting as far as to achieve non-profit status, which would allow him to swerve mandatory taxes. He did, however, subscribe to the Libertarian stance of just not paying them. As such, his tax bill increased and his personal circumstances deteriorated into impoverishment. Another ugly consequence of not paying taxes was, unsurprisingly, no social benefits. So Connell was forced to live off church collections from his tiny flock, but this was hardly enough to survive on. With time, he was unable to keep the heating on in a portion of the US known for particularly harsh winters, an existence very far from the idealized free market commonwealth many had been drawn to pursue. In 2012, the project was in its 8th year of existence. Nothing had been accomplished, and multiple problems persisted. Most of these problems would require some level of cohesion and coordination to remedy. This left them impossible to resolve for Grafton's free thinkers. But the Freetowners were at least heavily armed, and some realized that this could help them to at least face the festering bear problem. To be clear, murdering bears is rather illegal. Although New Hampshire had liberalized its bear hunting license laws to curb their electrifying population growth, shooting the animals wantonly would still be beyond the pale. And even if it were permitted, not everyone would agree to this being the right course of action, despite the increasing threat. Donut Lady was still spending her savings feeding them, and there were others with moral objections to any mass massacre of the creatures. Graftonite Tim Bowen was one of the latter, although he recognized this made him a minority in the town, when he memorably remarked to Hongoltz Hetling, quote, "It's like being a German in Nazi Germany and not wanting to kill the Jews." Jesus Christ. Unfortunately, a drought in Grafton that year left the bears more daring than ever. Despite the best efforts of Donut Lady, they were still hungry and willing to take greater and greater risks. And in late 2012, the inevitable occurred when a Grafton woman was mauled and severely injured by a bear on a porch. So some local men took matters into their own hands. In 2013, they headed into the forest and butchered 13 bears in their dens. They may have presumed that this wholly immoral and illegal act would see the problem resolved, but obviously it didn't. The Great Bear Massacre of 2013 didn't significantly impact the presence around Grafton or in New Hampshire, although bear attack reports did temporarily fall in the coming months. Hembold Hedling found that the Graftonites were reluctant to share details about the killings. In the course of his documentation of the strange town, the usually cheerful advice of "don't break onto my land or you'll get shot" became the much more concerning "be careful about your questions or you might get shot." The town ambled on, and the bear massacre turned to whispers and was never properly investigated. But the project was living on borrowed time, and things would come to a tragic head a few years later. In early 2016, a fire engulfed the old church house building. John Babash arrived on the scene, but there was little the firefighters could do to tame the blaze. The cause of the fire was not known, but its consequences soon were. The 200-year-old wooden building was gutted and reduced to near ruin. But there was something worse. John Connell was inside the building at the time, and he didn't make it out. Tragically, the 57-year-old pastor was found in the wreckage, having succumbed to smoke inhalation. The Freetown project didn't live on much further. Surprisingly, it wasn't the disputes, the presence of predators, the piles of accruing garbage, the faltering infrastructure, the church fire, the death of a community stalwart, or even the scores of psychotic bears that put an end to the initiative. No, instead, it was the fact that the whole idea leveled up. You see, you might think that a town populated by criminals, idealists, and some of the most naive people on Earth would be a pretty clear deterrent against similar such projects. But no. The Freetown project may have been a disaster, but it had limped so that the Free State project could lollop. The project was triumphantly unveiled in Manchester, New Hampshire in February 2016, less than a month after the harrowing death of John Connell in Grafton. It seemed to offer something the Freetown had never managed: stability, livability, and, by way of taxes, public amenities. Perhaps above all, it offered some semblance of mainstream political recognition, and in 2017, 17 Free Staters had made it to the 400-seat New Hampshire House of Representatives. None of them were from the Libertarian Party, which continued to flounder in the ballots. But amongst them was Silent Bob Hull, one of Freetown's founders, who served 2 terms for the Republican Party before passing away in 2019. The Free State Project had actually been founded even before its crazy Grafton cousin, going back to 2001 as the brainchild of political scientist Jason Sorens. Its mission was to entice 20,000 of the US's disparate libertarians to one single state, which, after a vote, was chosen to be New Hampshire. The objective was to accomplish this sizable political migration within 5 years. The project missed out on its deadline by about 11 years, but by 2016, the intended 20,000 had signed the Free State Project Statement of Intent. Some of these signatories had, by then, already taken up residence in New Hampshire, not least in Grafton, to its own great detriment. Still, the project was better planned, better organized, and better funded than its analog, and the announcement in February effectively wiped out the Freetown's remaining prospects overnight. Their work done, kind of, the Freetowners slowly packed up and shipped out. And what they left behind was a town in a sorry condition. Humboldt's Hetling poetically described what remained for the Graftonites as waking up after smashing a house party only to remember with growing horror that it had taken place in your own home. That's good. Several years later, he returned to the town to assess the damage. What he found was an empty and squalor-filled tent city. Adam Franz had given up and moved away, leaving behind a failed survivalist camp and a DUI conviction. He also found the wreckage of the church, which had remained in its sorry condition as disputes between the Libertarians and would-be proprietors raged, mostly over taxes. In Street View images from September 2023, the site continues in the same condition of disrepair. Despite all of this, some of Grafton's intransient libertarians had no desire to give up on their cause. Some devoted themselves to supporting the Free State Project, and some even to the full-on secession of the state of New Hampshire from the United States. John Babash went straight into political campaigning and failed in the 2018 State House of Representatives election with 175 votes against the victors' 2,300. On this occasion, he was joined by his wife Rosalie, who also ran in the election. Unwisely, they failed to unify their forces, and Rosalie ran with a total of 113 votes, last on the list. Today, the Free State Project lives on, and around the time of its foundation, it was joined by another libertarian startup in Europe, the Free Republic of Liberland, which was founded on a freebooted patch of land between Serbia and Croatia in December 2018. Both Liberland and the Free State continue to claim adherence today, if not quite the free market utopia promised on the brochure. Grafton retreated back to small-town New Hampshire status. Its population declined in the wake of the Freetowners' departure, but census figures between 2010 and 2020 showed it had risen to 1,385 individuals, a net increase of about 45. Thank you for watching.